Thank you very much, Sandra, and thanks very much for the invitation. On the plane ride over, I was sitting next to a very talkative New Zealander who said, "So whereabouts in the States are you from?" And being a Canadian, it's sort of like New Zealanders being called Australians, I suppose, or something. I had to explain that, well, there are differences. And he said, well, what are those differences? And that's the kind of question that gets Canadians. It throws us into this existential angst that 200 years of depression, very depressing Canadian literature hasn't been able to solve. But I thought about it some more, and I thought that there's actually one big difference that you can tell an American from a Canadian, and that is Americans begin every single talk with a joke. Canadians begin with an apology. And I'll do two tonight. I have two apologies. My first apology is, I'm sorry, I don't have a joke. The second apology is, I'm not going to give the talk I was going to give. Because also on the plane ride over, I realized that I've been giving a variation of this picture of what's happening globally for a long time. And increasingly, I noticed about 10 minutes into the talk, people's eyelids start to get a little heavy. There's some commotion around the door. My colleagues back in Canada kind of pull the alarm bells, fire alarms, to try and generate some interest. And I thought, maybe it's my delivery. I tried to be more engaging. That didn't seem to work. And I realized, as the great Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan said, maybe it's the message and the medium that I have to work on. So I thought maybe I had the wrong message. Maybe I'm on the wrong side of history here. So rather than talk about the Vandals of the Gates, I want to talk to you today not as interested educators, but as potential investors in an exciting new project. I want to take a look at the education market outlook, the global education market outlook, and try and convince you to fork over some of your hard-earned dollars into this venture. So I want to introduce to you my new company called Global Learn. We were actually founded about 2 weeks ago as Global Ed Inc., but on advice from legal counsel, we were told we shouldn't make mention of education. It may be false advertising. So we changed it to Global Learn. We are rebranded. Our motto was we put the earn and learn. And our corporate philosophy is that learning will be the international currency of the 21st century. You may have heard some other people say this recently, but we actually came up with it first. And our mission statement is to be the global leader in the development and provision of customer-driven learning solutions. You see, again, I don't use the word education. We worked very hard over the past couple of weeks to develop a feasible and viable business model. And through our discussions, we came up with what we call the Global Learning equation. It's a complicated equation, but I'll walk you through it. Essentially, we have Global Learn that provides information to our customers. We call that process learning. And our customers then send money to us. It's a virtuous circle. But I want to look a little bit now. I know you're saying, well, this all sounds too good to be true. What are the current market conditions? Is there actually a market for for-profit education globally? Well, you might be surprised to know that the global education market, according to OECD figures, is estimated to be worth about $2.2 trillion annually. So even a small piece of that pie will be healthy returns for you. Education exports are worth more to the UK than banking, than financial exports. That's even before that meltdown in 2008. And of course, in Australia, it's the number one export, even ahead of tourism. So this guy has no competition with us. International students are also big business these days. Here we see the growth in international student enrollments from 1975 to 2007. There's now over 3 million students who are internationally mobile. And for us, of course, that means there's a potential to make money. And we think that there's some opportunities, even here in New Zealand, where we're looking at setting up some branch plants. This is a chart showing the percentage of international students as a share of total enrollment. So it gives you a sense of the dependency of different countries on international students. You see Australia is the market leader right now, but New Zealand's number 5, just slightly behind Switzerland. So in terms of the overall share of international students within the student population, we think there's some good opportunities to be had here. We also see internationally that supply is not meeting demand. There's, according to the World Bank, a 10% annual enrollment growth in emerging markets. China, there's 15 million new students expected over the next 5 years. India, 5,000 applicants per place in some programs. So again, there's not domestic capacity. So we think, again, there's a huge business opportunity to be made here. This is happening now for the cross-border trade and education services. Let's look a little bit more at some of the emerging markets. We've identified the Middle East and Africa as one potentially important market because of demographic changes. We need greater efficiencies, more private services across the whole of education. This was actually a report that I stumbled across that the World Bank had prepared. So it also sees that there's an opportunity for market growth in these areas. Now, of course, Asia, with its expanding middle class, will become one of the most important education markets over the next few decades. We've seen huge improvements in school enrollment, which means there's more and more people coming into the tertiary sector. So, the global learn business model. How are we going to actually achieve or to take our share of the pie of some of these market opportunities? So we've developed what we call our Flexi Learn curriculum. That means you learn where, when, and how you want at your own pace. We have a very adaptable approach to this. We've coupled that with a no surprise graduation guarantee. We actually think that if students fail, it's our fault, not their fault. So you'll be guaranteed graduation. We have a go now, pay later financing plan. We offer this through our Subprime Lending Inc., a fully owned subsidiary of Global Learn. I'll give you some more information on that. We also have developed some very innovative human resources management. Along with our Flexi Learn approach, we have a Flexi Teach management style, which reduces unit labor costs. We don't have to hire full-time staff. We rely completely upon casual contract staff, and we unbundle the work so that we don't need teachers who develop curriculum and then actually teach and mark. We can break it up. We can have people who develop the curriculum, people who we call course deliverers, course markers, and course graders. We've also developed some global supply chain arrangements, which I'll explain in a moment. And for our staff, this means we can outsource a lot of work, paperwork overseas. Our global supply chain include a contract we've signed with this company called Virtual TA. I don't know if you've heard of this yet, but this is an actual company that allows teachers to outsource marking to offshore providers. And it's a great way to reduce your business costs, but also to make sure that students get the kind of feedback that they need. And in fact, there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education from a couple years ago. I talked about how other companies are now emerging on the scene that allow courses or course papers to be uploaded to India and other places where graduate students will mark them on a per piece basis. It's almost like a piecework job. So, I know I've convinced you there's a market opportunity. I know I've convinced you we have a good business model here. Now let's take a look at what the market competition is, because in order to get a share of this market, we're going to have to meet the competition. So who do we have? Well, there are private providers who are operating internationally. There's the Apollo Group, an American company that owns the University of Phoenix. University of Phoenix is the largest university in the United States. It also has developed or taken a page from our business plan. It has no full-time staff. It's all contract labor. It's one of the reasons why in the United States right now, 75% of people who teach at the college or university level are non-tenure track, that is hired on a casual short-term basis. There's also Navitas, an Australian company that offers foundation courses for international students into a British company that does similar things. So there is some competition we'll have to deal with. But we actually think that it's not the private providers we need to be worried about the most. It's actually the public schools, colleges, and universities that are acting more and more like private providers internationally that are our main competition. You've seen a number of institutions set up branch campuses. There's franchising or licensing arrangements. The University of Newcastle is a good example of this, where they've actually partnered with a local provider in India. So the local provider actually provides students with the University of Newcastle education, but the students never actually step onto the campus of the University of Newcastle. It's a kind of McDonald's-like franchise arrangement, right? There's cross-border e-learning, international student recruitment we've already talked about. So public schools and colleges and universities are acting more and more like private businesses, and so we have to be aware of that. That's something that makes me gravely concerned from my own market competition standpoint. So how are we going to meet the competition? Well, I think we can engage new student markets. I mentioned earlier about our subprime student loan system. Well, I got the idea, actually, again from the United States, where there was a story in Bloomberg Businessweek that I was reading when I was doing some market research. And this was a story about the University of Phoenix and some other private for-profit colleges who were recruiting homeless people into universities. Now, you may say, why would they do that? Well, this is very much like the subprime mortgages that led up to that little financial crisis blip we had in 2008, where lenders were lying to people who they knew couldn't afford to pay the mortgages, but in a way to pad their own particular profits. Well, the University of Phoenix came up with this brilliant idea. Why don't we recruit some homeless people? It's very unlikely they'll show up. But whenever they apply, they'll qualify for student financial assistance through the government. So they'll get government-backed loans. So they would go out, recruit people, they wouldn't show up. After 30 days, they would say these people didn't show up, but they would still collect the non-refundable fee. So a great business model. We think we can take advantage of this. Now, let's also look at some of the international market risks. Now, we've got a pretty sound business model. We've got a sense of what the competition is. We've got a good plan for future growth, but there are significant risks that we'll have to take into account. The first risk is various international trade barriers, things that stand in the way, regulatory measures that make it difficult for us to do the things we want to do. I'll go back to that. I know it was a complicated thing I showed very quickly, but we'll go back to that learning equation that I mentioned to you. So this is, again, global learn, information, students, money coming back. But when you put trade barriers in here, something happens. The student then who wants to purchase the product we have runs into a problem. That these trade barriers block our business exchange. And so they essentially, what are these trade and regulatory barriers? Well, in many cases, governments don't allow for accreditation opportunities for for-profits or offshore learning providers. I hate to say, but in many countries, we probably will not be allowed to operate. Local hiring requirements. These can raise our business costs. If we have to hire people locally or any other kind of performance requirement, it can make it more difficult for us to use our Flexi Teach human resource model. Local performance requirements and needs tests. Many countries would require us to invest a certain amount of money, to provide financial assistance for various students, to do all kinds of things that, frankly, businesses shouldn't do. And there's trade distorting public subsidies, government grants that are restricted only to local providers. So the University of Auckland gets a subsidy. If we're operating, we might not, and that puts us at a disadvantage in terms of our competition. And also what we call consumption subsidies, student loans that are limited only to nationals, for instance, would also be a regulatory or trade barrier. And in the end, what it means for you as investors is your pockets are essentially being picked. That in the name of so-called social objectives, we're actually losing money. I'll give you one example of this, is South Africa. In the 1990s in South Africa, there was, it had a fairly open market in terms of education services, and there was a flood of foreign learning institutions. In fact, many of them came from Australia. Monash University, which was a public institution but operated as a for-profit internationally, set up a branch campus. There were a number of other private career colleges and so on. So they were taking advantage of what were these new market openings. Now, one of the difficulties that the critics pointed to was that these offshore schools were cherry picking. That they were picking the popular and more lucrative courses like business, IT, that kind of stuff, where there was a large demand for it. And they were doing it over a shorter time span, and were kind of crowding out some of the public schools on this regard. So the South African government responded in a number of ways. It was also concerned, or alleged, that the programs being offered by the for-profits weren't actually meeting South Africa's development needs. And so they developed new legislation on accreditation and quality assurance for offshore providers. And what that meant was that suddenly all the offshore providers that were in South Africa had to reapply for accreditation. And of the 443 applications that were received, only 144 were approved. So they were essentially locked out of the market. And Monash University was one of them, had to shut down its campus and go back home. So the result, from a business perspective, barriers to trade, lost markets, right? Well, fortunately, we've had some success at the international level in trying to negotiate new sets of international trade rules that will more firmly protect business interests. The General Agreement on Trade and Services was our best hope for a long time. This was an attempt to try and get rid of those kind of regulatory and non-tariff barriers that were preventing companies like Global Learn and others from taking advantage of new markets. The GATS had a lot of potential at the beginning. We saw it as the way of eliminating these barriers to trade. It's a legally binding way of limiting these barriers. And according to the WTO training manual, an actual quote, by the way, it says, there are various economic and political advantages associated with liberalization commitments under the GATS, including overcoming domestic resistance to change. Now, I know before my presentation, many of you were probably part of that domestic resistance, but now you can change to the other side. But I think this points to the power that international trade agreements can have in locking in and intensifying these pressures of privatization and marketization. Now, there are some emerging risks. So the problem we had with GATS is that the negotiations remained stalled. Fortunately, however, we do have some regional trade negotiations, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and others, that are allowing for new opportunities to open up new education markets. But there still remains some emerging risks. One of these risks has to deal with that domestic opposition issue. Is that what started off as fairly small protests have subsequently grown a little bit. This is the Occupy Wall Street demonstration in New York from not too long ago. More troubling for us in some ways, this was a student demonstration in Chile just last year, where students were protesting the privatization of education. These are the kinds of pictures that keep business people like me awake at night. We get very nervous when we see this excess of democracy spilling out into the streets. This may lead governments to do things like limit the private powers that be. So we're very nervous about this, and we'll have to find ways to intensify our lobbying efforts, and I'm sure you'll all join me in doing so, in pushing back against the concerns about privatization and marketization. I think, just to conclude, when I look at the global education market today, I think today we're standing on the edge of a precipice. And before us lies this world of opportunity. And so I really hope that you'll all join me in taking one step forward. Thank you very much.